Okay, so we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our, oops, hold on one second. There we go. Welcome to the, I believe it's the third lecture now in our Lawrence Tech College of Architecture and Design virtual lecture series for spring 2021. My name is Emily Kudel, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers today on behalf of the Lecture and Exhibition Committee. First, I'll say a few things about our college. The College of Architecture and Design at Lawrence Technological University offers degrees in architecture, interior design, graphic design, game art, transportation design, industrial design, and urban design. We're dedicated to a pedagogy of theory and practice, which is the original motto of Lawrence Tech University, advocating not one or the other, but both, integrated and coherent. In our lecture series, we like to look for people who can draw connections between design disciplines, because we are a multidisciplinary school, and who can examine the technologies that we use as designers. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers tonight, Galo Canizares and Stephanie Delgado of Office CA. Stephanie and Galo are both currently faculty at Texas Tech College of Architecture. Galo is a designer, writer, and educator who holds an MArch from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His current research concerns the softwarization of architectural media after the rise of digital culture. Stephanie is a registered architect and was recently a teaching fellow at the School of Architecture at Taliesin. She received her Master of Architecture from the Knowlton School at Ohio State, where she was awarded the Graduate Enrichment Fellowship and the Architecture Research Travel Award. I'm looking forward to learning more about their collaborative practice, Office CA, which investigates the relationships between geometry and non-objective narratives. They aim to highlight hidden oddities or curiosities that constitute our daily interactions with spaces and objects in both physical and virtual worlds. So thank you so much for joining us today. I think without further ado, we can get started.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. We're really excited to be here and joining the Lawrence Tech's lecture series. And tonight, we're really going to kind of focus the behind the scenes and our ambitions when it comes to representation and drawings and how that kind of guides our projects. So really for us, the representation spectrum really goes from two things: realism to abstraction. And while realism focuses on being true to life and abstraction seems to break it down, we see the literal as existing between the two. For us, the literal is an alternative that replicates our daily lives. It's full of inaccuracies, awkwardness, absurdities, and potential misreadings and narratives. We're all for misuse and misreadings of architecture and language. The literal is not quite realistic. It's not really abstract. It can be considered banal. It is what it is. It's quotidian. It's everyday. In its dictionary definition, the literal means to be free from exaggeration or distortion. We're also interested in the colloquial misuse of the adverb literally, as seen here in Parks and Rec with Chris Traeger. He's like, I literally love everything. Literally everything's the best. If this misuse is good enough for like Jane Austen, Mark Twain, Chris Traeger, it's good enough for us. And we really gotta encourage this misuse of the adverb. For us, language is power. And language comes from an area of authority. So we can start to break down authority through language. That's kind of like how it guides our projects. And literally it's used when vehicle for the figuratively falls short. When we consider both words, literal and literally, in both their dictionary definitions and colloquial use, we can find a new territory for design. One where we replicate the everyday world, but also reimagine its potential future narrative by asking speculative questions. The beauty of the word literal is that it can either mean figuratively or actually. It embodies a paradox, one that asks for specific translations and the other for vagueness. With this in mind, our work seeks to balance a balance between sincerity and irony. We really have three types of project types and drawing types that we try to do. The first is reenactments. So a lot of times when you think about reenactments, it'll be like the Civil War or more like general civic and military events, but we think about reenactment as something as documentary. We approach the historical through the recreations of historical events. We use the word reenactment instead of recreation because we like to capture the movement and momentum as though we are drawing a performance. We value focusing on the less notable moments in history. We're not interested in redrawing a Palladian villa. Instead, we are interested in the moments that are forgotten, but are critical to our use of software and how architecture is taught and made. The second is scenarios, which is narrative. We focus on creating scenarios from the predictable to the unpredictable, as best we can with the unpredictable. We use scenarios as operational tools to embed our products within narratives. The use of scenarios let us emphasize or focus on user interaction and user agency. The third, simulations or technical. We regard simulations as technical projections of how things will unfold in a given situation. We work with animation software and game engines to explore how real-world physics might change our perception of materials or give users more agency. Our simulations are primarily software-based, but also have a large narrative component to them.
Right. So we're going to start by talking about some projects and really how they relate to some of these broader umbrella terms. So for reenactments for us, like Stephanie said, are documentary type of images or a kind of documentary image making process, right? So they illustrate events that either have happened or are assumed to have happened. They're really a way for us to document history and events in a very specific way. I think the clearest example is probably in this book that I recently published in 2019. It's called Digital Fabrication, Designer Stories for a Software-Based Planet. And it's published by Applied Research and Design out of California. So the book itself is a collection of essays on what the media theorist Lev Manovich calls the softwareization of media, right? This idea that most media today is now facilitated through software or some kind of a digital interface, right? Even our thermostats are controlled through software. Some toothbrushes are controlled through software. So really the book is kind of asking questions about what is our ongoing relationship to software and how to unpack this kind of invisible layer that's really affecting the way that we think and the way that we go through our daily life. And so as part of the stories of this book, really there was a need to kind of illustrate some of these concepts, right? And so the book really explores spatial, political, and technical conditions that have emerged as a result of everything becoming software, right? And so the illustrations that follow it are really partially didactic, right? They kind of they show how some of these devices work. They kind of show the situations in which these devices were kind of invented and disseminated. But I think the most important part about these illustrations that are contained in this book is that they are reenactments of either historical imagery or found imagery, right? So instead of relying on existing images, we could potentially, like I think the traditional way of doing this is to pay for copyright image permissions and then publish those images in a book as kind of evidence, right? Unfortunately, image rights are really expensive. So for the book, really, it was kind of like the strategy for recreating or reenacting these images was a kind of economic it was driven economically, right? But other than that, the recreation of these images also allowed us to control the entire scenography of the image, right? We could sort of reconceive of the staging of some of these scenarios, and it really became a kind of design process in and of itself. And we could also control the copyright, obviously, but also we could establish a kind of cohesive visual language for the book. So this is a kind of example of an image that's contained in this book. And so, the image on the right is an image from Xerox PARC in California, and it's really where the graphical user interface was invented. And this is an image that it's pretty canonical in the history of computation and user interface design. Obviously, the rights for this image are pretty pretty expensive. And so, the avenue that we went down was really to just recreate it. And so we could control the staging and we could control the visual language of the image. And it really sort of established kind of a new trajectory for our representational strategies moving forward. The images contained in the book were also an opportunity to play with existing imagery and reinterpret them in a kind of tradition of an art forgery, right? So we can sort of we can think of these reenactments as forgeries in the same tradition of just like recreating paintings, for instance. Like, so on the left you have a recreation of a painting by Rene Magritte, and on the right you see the original, right? And the shift in perspective was actually super important, and again it kind of was a really interesting design exercise. I think what became clear after the manuscript for the book was written was that the accompanying images really needed to tell stories by themselves as well, right? So they, on the one hand, they could be illustrations of some of the concepts that were being laid out, but on the other hand, they could also be a kind of photo essay or just a kind of narrative by themselves, right? And so they really started to work together like visual episodes, and they were really they had to contain the same information, but also the same kind of qualities as the original images, right? So here, for instance, is an image of the ENIAC computer, which is one of the earliest mainframe computers. And this image is sort of seldom seen in the history of computation, but it really talks about the involvement of women in the early days of computation, which is something that is a narrative that's sort of often excluded from the history of computation. And so in the book, there's a recreation of this kind of image, right? And all of the details are again recreated and restaged from a different point of view. But I think the quality kind of still remains the same, or at least the story still remains the same, right? And so in terms of the process, it really was a process of kind of breaking down images and looking at all of the objects and the spaces and the characters and rebuilding those from scratch. A lot of the imagery also came from old advertisements. I think advertisements are really interesting because they're kind of like symbolic images from that represent kind of cultural values, right? So advertisements are actually some of the most powerful imagery that's already out there, and recreating it is kind of an interesting process as well, right? Ads are also super staged, right? Like this one, for example, which is an ad for the IBM. I think it's one of the first IBM computers or desktop computers. And so, because in ads, all of these objects have meaning attached to them, it was important to address these kind of as ideological images, right? As images that sort of put forth a specific kind of ideology. And the reenactment of these images really was almost a way to introduce either like a different idea into it or extract a different concept out of it as well. And so, the images range from, let's say, stills from videos, right? This is a still from a video documentary on David Hockney, who was one of the earliest artists to engage with drawing software, right? This is before Photoshop. He's using a technology called Quantel Paintbox, and there's also sort of a reimagining of canonical images as well. For example, this is a reimagining of one of Ezra Stoller's famous photographs of the interior of Skidbar, Owings and Merrill, which show the kind of infinite field of drafting desks that show the kind of labor of design. And this was obviously a different perspective on it, but it still shows, the relationship to the tools, even the kind of scale of the office, and the typical inhabitants, which is this kind of suited white male, right, in those days. And then, this is another type of reenactment. This is an image of a kind of typical architecture firm in the 1990s, showing again the relationship to software, but also kind of extracting more of the kind of quotidian qualities of office life as it was kind of happening in the 1990s. And so we've started to also create kind of reenactments of our own projects or of our own processes as well, right? So it's not only these kind of canonical images that were really important for us to reenact or re-envision, but really our projects. We were thinking of different ways to expose the labor behind our projects, right? Not just show the end result in a kind of synthesized, neatly packaged way, but actually to show the kind of messiness of the process through just a kind of redrawing of the process, right? So this image is actually part of a series of reenactments that document our ongoing project called hot wire casting. This project is an experimental method for combining powdered PLA, which is the 3D printer material, and sand into a kind of strong architectonic material. And it is kind of a tricky process, but essentially what it entails is running a copper tube inside of a mixture of PLA and sand, and you run a current in that copper tube to heat up the tube, kind of like a wire cutter. And so the heat basically ends up melting the plastic around it in the mixture of plastic and sand. And then after it cools, it solidifies into the shape that the tube was in, essentially. So if you change the shape of the tube, you can cast this solid mixture of plastic and sand. And so when we were doing these material experiments, we thought about the way that fabrication is typically communicated in architecture school and in the architecture profession, right? It's typically a kind of disembodied process, right? You show the animation of the parts kind of coming together, or you show the final result and you show maybe some diagrams of how you got there, but really it is very much disembodied, and the labor of construction is sometimes omitted. Usually maybe it's included as part of like documentary images or like a time lapse or something like that. But largely, the attention is paid to the final artifact, right? And so here we reverse that and we paid attention to the process of building and making these plastic things, right? So you see some of the like the dust that kind of comes out of this process. You see the tools that we're using in the process. You see like the electricity. You see the plugs. So you see like the kind of junk that we engage with in order to like actually be able to innovate with these materials. And so as we're talking about these reenactments or the strategy of reenacting, one thing that typically started to come up was how do we populate these drawings, right? I mean, do we project ourselves into them? Obviously, when you're recreating a canonical image, you try to get close to the figure that was in there, but it's pretty hard unless you're a professional kind of 3D sculptor to actually get that right. So there's again that negotiation between realism and abstraction in our image making process. But that negotiation also is kind of a political one, right? We start to think about like how do you represent people in an equitable way, in a way that doesn't just perpetuate the kind of whitewashing of entourage that is sometimes prevalent in architectural representation, right? And so, of course, like architecture has a long history of people just kind of making their own scale figures or representing scale figures in their own ways. So what we started thinking about is how can we actually share some of the scale figures that we've been thinking about, and how can we fill in gaps in representation, right? So we started this website called peopling.studio, and peopling.studio is a kind of repository for 3D scenes of individuals that could represent a wide variety of persons and of different abilities, different body shapes, and different skin tones. I mean, skin tone is kind of, usually the default skin tone is white, right? So here we kind of reverse the default into black or brown. And it's just as a way to, comment on what's missing in this area of representation. And we also, we're providing these scenes for free, so anybody can just go there and download it. And we try to prioritize more in a kind of technical mode of working, open source software, things that are more accessible that you don't have to pay subscription fees to, or illegally kind of work around it. So our scale figures, I mean, it's a relatively new kind of side project that we're engaging in, but it really fits into this idea of reenactments and a kind of ethical way of engaging representation. The other dimension to this was also to help students find material that they can use really, really easily, right? So students are always going to find the path of least resistance when it comes to finding objects to make their drawings or to help them make their drawings. And usually the content that's free online is kind of questionable at best, right? Anything that's free has some kind of a missing component. And so, we're trying to fill in those missing components by providing free thought scenes that we think can tell different stories, right? We've got different sort of accessories in these scenes as well. But it's important to understand that these aren't necessarily objects, right? Again, we like to think in narratives. We like to think as scenes, not as like objects or things, right?
All right. Scenarios. Events that could happen, may happen. So we're going to go over a few projects that uses the idea of scenarios, of making scenes and using narrative as a main driver. So in 2018, we were fortunate enough to win the Ragdale ring competition. And it really was to design an outdoor stage for Ragdale House in north of Chicago. Ragdale was designed and built by Howard Van Doren Shaw, an architect. His wife was an artist, a poet, so he built places for her to perform. So the ring originally, where the competition gets a name, was a performing ring. So every year, Ragdale has this competition where it asks anybody to submit what can be a temporary installation that can be used for a lot of different types of performances, from puppetry to band performances to dancers. Like how can a piece of architecture play a role as a set? So really, we were thinking about like interfaces. When we think about the word interface or interface designers, we think about your iPad or your iPhone. We're thinking about specifically website. We think about like the Instagram, how Instagram changed their layout and everybody got mad. So we think about it as more of a digital, but really as architects and as designers, we are building interfaces of the physical world. We touch doors, we open windows. So we were really trying to see like, how can we make an interface that's an experimental playground for adults and children? So really there's two components for the project. The static, which are the walls. For one side of the green, it kind of peels up from the ground to kind of blend into the scenery. The more sculpted side, showing its plastic nature, painted bright blue. And then the noodles, which are dynamic, which can be moved any way you could. You can pile them up, you can use it as seating. So really kind of this idea of static and dynamic. And going along this kind of conversation about labor and showing how we could build something. So Ragdale does ask, like, how are you going to build this? They want to know how you can do it. So we're like, oh, it's going to be traditional frame. At this point in 2018, we're thinking about more general abstract figures. So we've kind of really moved away from that, but showing labor within our projects. As you can tell, our projects are really all about the kind of fuzzy things. We like soft elements to kind of change this idea that architecture has to be stiff. Architecture has to be hard and stone, but architecture can be curtains. Architecture can be fabric. So we have two sides. Each side of the wall is covered in turf. The green side looks like it's peeled from the ground. The blue side looks to be sculpted. The yellow side, we never ended up padding. We just painted that blue. And conceptually, we were really thinking about Noodle Soup empowering individuals. How can we let somebody control the environment they're in? A lot of times when we design, we don't really think about how it's going to be used later on. But for us, we were like, we wanted this to be destroyed. We wanted people to wreck it, have fun, jump through like the holes, to use it as a slide. We were interested in like, many different options can we give somebody? And I think when it came to the grid, we really didn't know what was going to happen. Our students, so we built it with some students who were gracious enough to come with us. Thank God for them, because we wouldn't probably build this by ourselves in 2 weeks by 2 people. But they started climbing the walls, and we're like, "What? You can climb the walls?" We didn't even think about it. They could climb a 10-foot wall easily. Children were pulling the noodles through the holes to make slides. The puppetry show started using the openings in the walls to kind of create a stage set, a curtain. The still dancers were kind of like highlighting the height of the project. So it was really bizarre and interesting to see how many unpredictable ways came up with it. And a lot of the times what we like to do is that we redraw a project that we do. We redraw it to kind of learn something new, to re-represent it with what we think happened. So this chart that kind of shows that. So there's a lot of these elements here that we never kind of expected, like somebody pushing a wall. We did see somebody trying to push a wall. People climbing it. What's missing is the deer would like dance on the stage at night. So there'll be a lot of like paw prints that ruin the paint. But I'll accept that as a good option. Different ways that noodles could be used. And I think that became like really critical for us is how do we make a piece of architecture that's not controlled? This is a more recent project. In 2019, we entered the home competition, which really asked the question like, what is the house of the future? For us, we were lucky enough to receive an honorable mention in the innovation category. For us, we're like, what's the future of architecture? And we were thinking about like, what can we make like dumb future? And really, we're like, what if an elevator was a house? What if an elevator could start to move up and down to create accessible spaces, a constantly configurable house, and a house that really promises the high-tech future that we thought the 60s was going to give us. The 21st century has yet to fulfill its predecessor's promise of capsule, pod, and spaceship living. So for us, we're like, how can we make the future that's a little bit more sci-fi without breaking away from traditional components of architecture? So we were really exploring this idea of domestic gadgetry and how, an internal system. So when we think about buildings and we think about pipes, the motors to run the elevator, normally that's all hidden within walls, within chases. Here we're like, what if we put everything outside? What if the house moved, and when it moves, it starts to create different scenarios for the city? The house's relationship and the user's relationship to the city start to change all the time. So we also imagine this will be a more urban future. The site is just a random urban site. And really we're like, how can we be radical, pragmatic when it came to producing a house of the future? So this has 16 possible configurations, and it has an externalized fluid installation system. And it reverses the type of arrangement of house intestinal systems to produce a space that is modular, mutable, and accessible for all. As you see in this section, each module moves up and down. So again, its relationship to the street is constantly changing. So now people can see people dining. People can see people cooking. When the modules are all down, the house presents a really strong presence of the street. This is not an alleyway you can cross. But when the house is all up, that becomes an alleyway for the city. When we were thinking about this, we're like, this is domestic. So we need to show domestic scenes. But in these scenes, we start to show different conditions of private versus public within the house itself. So for most part, like on the left side and the bottom right one kind of shows a typical scene. Dining room next to a kitchen with family, bedroom next to a closet. But on the top right one, we can see that the modules don't exactly have to move completely up or completely down, but they could be halfway to create a semi-private space and create moments where people have privacy within this modular house full of glass, and moments where you can still see and yell at your children if they're breaking something. So we kind of assume this will be the future of elevator building, which will mostly be robots. So again, kind of showing labor, but in this labor, we assume it'll be motorized, robotized. So like we have an inspector checking everything out to make sure that it's built correctly. But really it's kind of like, how can we use an existing technology and not reinvent the wheel? Seen in the elevations, the fluid installation moves with the house, becoming a larger and squishier as each elevator goes up and goes down. its relation to the street is constantly changing, and it's changing its presence within the street. So as we can see on the left, it billows at the bottom, making an entryway. As do we see to the right, we see how it billows up. It starts to say everything's cut. There's no entryway anymore to this alleyway. So this is another project of ours called a series on unidentified objects that we did in 2017 for the Chicago Architectural Biennale. We were like on the sideshow, so we were next to it, not part of the Biennale. You know, although science fiction is usually associated with futuristic visions, the stories that stand out the most are typically those that are put forward as analogies to contemporary issues. Therefore, we can say that sci-fi can be used as a proxy to critique matters of the present. Using this conceptual strategy, the project sought to respond to the topic of otherness by inviting an audience to participate in a collective science fiction performance. What's really key about this is 2017. So we were thinking about this project, we were thinking about Donald Trump was elected in 2016. So we're thinking about what does it mean to be others, me being a first generation American, Galo getting his citizenship recently from 2017. So like, how does it feel to be an other, to be Latino, in a society where your president is telling you that you're not welcome? So really, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about how can we get people to feel the otherness without being hitting over their head, being like, we're talking about politics. So we went with science fiction, which A, we just love science fiction movies, but B, is a way to kind of think about other without directly allowing people to really immerse themselves in the narrative. So this installation is composed of 2 inflatables, one shiny and one see-through. As visitors approach the inflatables, we will be actors with 2 students, so we'll stop and we're like, well, we're from a government agency. You need to answer a few questions. The actors will ask, or the agents will ask, do you know any aliens? Do you know any non-human? So for some, they're like, I don't have little green people in my house. They don't live in my attic. For others, there were, hey, I'm not from this country. I am an alien. And we wanted both responses. We didn't want a monotone of what does it mean to be an other. Inside each habitat, we had these 3D printed alien specimens that we call alien babies. They're 3D printed, like manipulated cubes to made into spheres. And we put them inside of Jello, and we were trying to make sure they didn't melt. So we had kind of these light tables kind of keep pushing this idea of other, like change how we perceive the visual language of the other. Yeah, the materials will work together to give the science fiction feel and quality. This is kind of a time lapse of the construction. So to the left is the construction itself, which is mostly just inflating 2 inflatables, and to the right is the performance. So you'll see 2 of us walking around with flashlights being like, who are you? You must report to us before you enter this habitat, and answering kind of these questions. The other reason for it was that the inflatables can't have too many people at once. If not, it loses pressure. So we're trying to keep the inflatables inflated while also kind of being part of this performance. This is our most latest installation. It was for the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. They have kind of this hallway gallery, and it's COVID. So we were thinking, what is something that we can do both in person and virtually while building a physical installation? So from the outset, we want to make something delightful and optimistic to counteract the anxiety, or lack of better words, misery that was abundant at the time. Our design consisted of 2 parts: a physical social distance seating space and a web-based drawing app. For the physical part, we designed a 30-foot long sheer curtain. The idea behind this, you have these blobby openings, and the blobby openings, you basically sit down, creates a social distance space for students that are going in person. They have a few in-person classes, but not everybody's there. The other aspect are the TVs with the app, the web app. So anybody can get on their phone, on their laptop. It has a webcam, so you can see an abstracted version of people there. Because of security issues, we didn't want to create something that was totally realistic and you can tell who it was. But instead, it was this abstraction, so you felt that you were part of the installation and not separate from it. The other component was a collaborative online drawing interface accessible at ourpaper.space. We can add this to the chat later, so if people want to join, you're more than welcome to. Here, users were invited to draw together anonymously with no real end goal. We like making useless apps. It was more about the experience of drawing together over the internet which during the pandemic seemed appropriate. We did change it to more abstract drawing utensils, because if you make it something too realistic, people are going to draw unsavory things and write unsavory things. So abstraction was also a key item, learning what people will do on the internet.
Our last in our project categories is simulations, or events that will happen to some degree. So simulations for us are really technical projections of how things will unfold in a given situation, or in a given situation. We work with animation software and video game engines to explore how real world physics might change our perception of materials, or even how the act of drawing, as we saw in the previous project, might become more dynamic and collaborative. And so, the first kind of animation or simulation that we engage in is really a kind of material simulation, right? Because we work a lot with soft materials. These tools for simulating soft bodies and pressure, et cetera, allow us to play with different arrangements and different dynamic effects. So for a Noodle Soup project, for instance, you can see here the beanbags were simulated as inflated tubes that could deform around the structures, and that really helped us design, one, the kind of length of the tube that we needed, and two, the kind of geometry of the static elements, right? So the simulations basically gave us a kind of proof of concept for how the noodles would be used, and I think it definitely helped us win the competition. But I think, so this is the kind of more traditional approach to simulation, right? It could be akin to structural simulations, right? But another type of simulation is really these web-based apps. Here, this is the web-based app that we made for the project Noodle Soup as well. And we wanted to kind of communicate the dynamism of the physical installation virtually in some way, so that if anybody wanted to engage with the concept and the geometry of the project, but wasn't able to make it out to Lake Forest, they could access it, right? So it becomes a kind of accessibility thing as well, to democratize access to the installation in one way. And so the app is actually still up. You can go to ragdalenoodles.co and you can sort of check it out on your mobile browser, play around with it. And technically, it's a little bit more of an animation than a simulation, right? It's a kind of procedural animation that you can interact with in some way. But really, the goal is to kind of complement the physical installation here with a virtual component that really that doesn't necessarily rely on like virtual reality or augmented reality. Some of these things that, well, we haven't really played with, but we're more interested in, again, this kind of level of abstraction, right? I think sometimes augmented reality gets a little bit too specific, or constraining in a way. So the last couple of projects that we're going to show are really more on the abstract end of the spectrum, right? Where we've been making these web-based apps that make use of physics simulation engines for web browsers for a while now. This one is an app called Malevich. And again, you can access it on mobile and desktop browsers. Our goal is always to make these things kind of cross-platform accessible. And really the kind of higher level concept of these apps is really to look at the spatial mechanisms of the web and maybe try to tease out something like the architectonics of the web, right? We all sort of understand that there are associations with space that are used in online, right? Like websites, home pages, right? So there is a kind of rhetoric, a kind of spatial rhetoric that's used online, but it's purely kind of iconographic, right? How can we use our techniques for understanding abstract space in a web browser, for instance, right? In a way that it doesn't rely on just text and icons. So Malevich is really a kind of a very minimalist app that relies on simple gestures for creating shapes. And here it's almost like the act of drawing becomes a kind of simulated act, right? Just pointing, clicking and dragging. All of these gestures that we kind of take for granted are really core components of this app. And obviously, the name clearly gives it away. It clearly references the Russian supremacist movement, and it also ties conceptually to the theories of suprematism that were laid out by Kazimir Malevich. Primarily the ideas of 2D abstraction, Lissitzky's ideas of irrational three-dimensional space, for instance. And so we also have kind of like writings, there are essays that go along with some of these apps. But what's really interesting about this app is that because it makes use of the kind of graphical processing part of your computer, it tends to have some kind of like tangential effects, right? So the longer that you use this app, for instance, your phone or your computer starts to heat up, or the fan starts to go faster. So it reveals the energy use of software, right? So it sort of materializes software in kind of an interesting way. Lissitzky.xyz is a kind of complement to Malevich. It's a 3D version of the kind of useless pointing and clicking app that Malevich kind of like sets up. Here, there's also a kind of gravity component. There's some forces that we're playing with, and again, the goal is really just to move and to just enjoy it. There really is no kind of productive way to use these things. I mean, I guess you could sort of think about maybe ways of coming up with a massing scheme or something like that, but it's really not geared for that. It's not made to be useful in a way. It's supposed to kind of call attention to just a kind of passive graphical use or engagement, I guess. This is some stills from Lissitzky. You can sort of see how it ties into Lissitzky's ideas of irrational space. This idea that the parallel projection is really a nice way of conveying infinity in abstraction, right? Because there is no depth. You can't really see how far away any of these objects are from one another. And so I think what's really most relevant. What these simulation tools really started to suggest for us is really a way of working within the paradigm of real time, right? So how do we document things that are happening simultaneously without resorting to videos or to screenshots? Like, can we record gestures, or can we record interactions that are not that are sort of literal but not realistic, and also not super abstract, right? That are somewhere in between. I think the performance of producing architecture today always, already relies on terms like surveillance, synchronization, real-time monitoring, right? So there's all of this technology that's geared towards like productive, like building, for instance, is kind of I don't know, it's like too much in a way for us. And so we're really trying to engage real time in a different way, maybe in a more delightful way, maybe in a more abstract way, I guess. So using game engines and simulation software really allows us to assert more agency and explore different narratives that might come out of real-time technologies. And so as a kind of postscript, I just wanted to show some stills from a project that is still ongoing. This is kind of in beta, but we've been making this this web-based collective kind of space called mask.space. And you can actually check it out if you go to mask.space, MASQUE on your browser. And it's basically a kind of an abstract space that you can interact with different people. It's kind of like a multiplayer game, sort of, but really it follows John Haydock's concept of the architectural mask, right? And really the goal is to provide an alternative model for virtual engagement, right? It's not a chat box. It does have a little bit of a chat box, but it's limited to 20 characters. It's not a multiplayer game, really. There are no goals. And it's really something more ephemeral and abstract, building off of the previous apps. And really the priorities here are community building and delightfulness, so the colors are sort of, cutesy, and we encourage everyone to be, very civil. There's even like a profanity filter that we have on there too. But it's really just a kind of experiment in online collectivity that really started before the pandemic, but now have really become almost like crucial, right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Galo and Stephanie. That was super interesting lecture. And I just want to remind everybody who's watching that if you're watching on the YouTube, you can enter questions into the chat on YouTube, and we will ask them here. So feel free to do that, as well as, of course, folks on the Zoom. So I have a question, maybe to get us started. It's kind of a double question, I guess. I've been sort of like thinking about all of the installations and apps that you presented in relationship with the images that you started with, the reenactments of the ways that design technologies shape our workspaces, our work lives, and thinking about how the kind of redrawing of those images kind of miniaturizes the scene, or like turns it into a kind of like dollhouse or an action figure scene where the objects, the details, like the poses matter. And I was sort of thinking about this. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about the kind of process that you go through in redrawing those images, the kinds of conversations that you have about the editing and reinterpretation or modification that you do. But I'm also curious about how drawings like this, or kind of ways of drawing like this, could impact the ways that we approach something as basic as like a post-occupancy evaluation, and whether you are interested in post-occupancy evaluation in your own work. Like, do you track what's happening within the scenarios that you stage, either like in your physical installations or even in the online apps?
Yeah, maybe we could start with the second part. So tracking is a little bit tricky, right? Obviously, because we're not really interested in perpetuating the kind of culture of surveillance, right? But post occupancy is really interesting for us. And maybe the best example is Noodle Soup. Really, that's probably the kind of biggest project that we've done so far physically, and so it was really important for us to see how the space was actually used after we left. So we came back a couple of times. Well, actually, we came back once, and then we got a lot of documentary images of what happened afterwards, and we really scrutinized those, and we really searched for things that we didn't predict, right? So we set up these scenarios, and then we're really interested in the unpredictable, mostly because we want to learn, and we want to think about how reflecting the fact that our authorship is never final, right? And so we are basically so we analyze those images, and then we redraw them. Mostly just because it's a kind of nice exercise. I think it's just a nice exercise to keep building off of the same project, so that it's
closure.
Yeah.
And it feels like closure, like you find, like you've given it away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So post occupancy it's not like I wouldn't say it's a kind of scientifically methodical process of post occupancy analysis, right? It's not quantitative. It really is sort of more speculative and if anything, qualitative to a certain degree, but I don't know. I think that's really what we are. We're storytellers, right? And so we want to think about the effects of these stories and then think about the next story as well.
I think a good way to put it is I think we're wannabe filmmakers and actually never went into film. So we're trying to kind of produce these like film narratives or scenarios that appear in our architecture. Like we just got drawn into architecture. When it came to Noodle Soup, what's really funny is in the last day of the installation is kind of the big performance, the opening night. And people didn't know what to do. They're like, do I sit here? Do I sit on the art? Like I brought my lawn chair. Like there was this kind of conversation. So I was like, hey, students, you have to stage your acting. So like we had the students act as though they were like visitors, like start to sit at different places. Like we're showing kids, like there are moms yelling at their kids, like, you cannot hit the art. And we're like, no, hit the art, hit it, destroy it, it's fine. So like we had to remind them that, you know, there wasn't a pristine element. So we don't ever try to convict, make something super pristine and prestigious, but instead something that's used. I think that's also something with Noodle Soup. So for Noodle Soup, we kind of broke our rules. So in the reenactments, they're always at isometrics. We keep this as kind of like an architecture drawing, but for Noodle Soup, there are perspectives because we wanted to win. So we break our own rules. But that's why I think there's also like a big visual difference. The point of view is that the reenactments are isometrics, the rest are perspectives, because the isometric are mostly going to be looked by architects. The perspective for ragdale, the competition or the judges aren't architects. So we wanted to make it more familiar.
Yeah, and so the rules for, or the kinds of discussions that happen around some of the reenactments are primarily about realism, right? So we really, the kind of discussion that we have is like, well, do we keep it kind of abstract, or do we go for realism? And the way that we've sort of gone about this is basically, we've decided that we want to use the tools for realism, because I think those tools are really powerful. So for like, for example, realistic lighting, realistic materials, and simulation, realistic kind of simulations. So we use the tools of realism, but we use them in ways that are a little bit less conventional, and we kind of break the tool of realism just to pull it away from some of the, let's say the kind of popular imagery that you see on like Art Daily or something like that, right? These kind of shiny renders, these like super hyper realistic
trees and the skyscrapers,
landscape drawing, or like landscapes with a house in the middle with like really nice materials. Like we're using the exact same tools, but we're changing the perspective, we're changing the scale of the objects and the composition to, sometimes it's even like kind of impossible, some of the perspectives that we achieve, because we just have to have all these elements in the shot, like in the composition. And so we kind of had to fake it, right? Like for example, even some of the reenactments, like the reenactment of one of the computer mainframes, that the way that the components of that mainframe are laid out are actually kind of impossible or not realistic in a sense. Like it's not true to the plan that I was basing it off of. It's actually more composed for the image itself. So the things are actually closer together than they're farther apart than they would be in real life, just for the composition, right? So again, we're also designers, right? So we design the image how we see fit, and so the discussion is really like how true do we want to be? Like how literal do we want to be?
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the YouTube. So Luke Blair is asking, what is the role of social interactivity in the web apps? It seems like they are catered to small groups of, say, 5. So what is the role of scale?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean,
I haven't even thought about it.
So scale when it comes to those types of apps is really an important issue, mostly because of infrastructure, right? So those apps are made are built off of are built on server-side scripts. So it basically means you have to buy a server time, or you have to buy server space in order to be able to host those apps and make them accessible to different multi-users, right? And so because you have to buy server space, they cost money, and we're not like making money off of these apps either. So we rely on services that don't really scale up very high, like our paper space and mask space were built on this platform called Heroku, which up to like 600 hours of like access is free. And so if all of a sudden everyone starts to access those apps, then it might actually break, because the infrastructure isn't there, right? Because we're not we're not like engineers or computer scientists, right? So we don't have like anything in the cloud, or like a really big kind of platform on the cloud that we're building this off of. So scaling up is actually like, I don't know, it's kind of scary just in general, but we don't really see these apps as going like getting that popular that we actually need to invest in a more robust infrastructure. So right now, the fact that they're kind of intimate actually works for us, both kind of conceptually, but also pragmatically. Like we just don't have the resources to be able to have like, 500 people accessing this app at the same time.
I also don't think I want, like going back to conceptually, like I don't want 500 people on the app. Like what we discovered with our paper space when it was less abstract was that people write like profanities, phallic objects were drawn. Like the more people have access to it, like the more it gets abused, especially because the internet is, you think you're behind a screen, so you're protected, you feel protected. And because, we're not computer science engineers, like we're not tracking who it is. We don't know who the user really is. We also don't want it to go so out of hand that we're helping white supremacy, that we're helping larger issues of oppression. So intimate is what we can handle too. Like design-wise, like we are not capable of larger because we're not taught, we're not computer scientists, we're just not engineers.
Right. So basically like a really big concept behind the apps is really a kind of proof that you can build sort of independent communities through these tools. And so the more people that can actually program and start to make some of these tools, the more communities you can actually build, right? And so the scale is kind of nice at that level. Because I think the problem with a lot of apps today is really that they try to be the number one app, right? So right now you've got this app called Clubhouse. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but like Clubhouse is like the thing now that you have to get an invite, you have to know somebody that knows somebody. And over the weekend, it's like started to crash because everybody wanted to be a part of this. And it's like everyone has FOMO, a fear of missing out on this app. I don't really see the appeal, but it's a really interesting phenomenon to actually just like see happen in real time, right? Is that this app is going to be the next TikTok or the next Instagram or something, and they need to scale up, and because they want to be that popular. Is there room for more independent, more smaller apps that are geared towards smaller communities? I think that's really what we're asking.
Yeah. We're also like not famous, so we don't really expect people to be using it that much. Like not that many people know who we are.
Yeah.
We have a request for you to paste the links to these in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will definitely do it.
I have a question with your Noodle project and the simulation afterwards. It was interesting to see how people interact with it, and then your reenactment, and then seeing the simulations. And I'm wondering what was the stages that you built these different parts, because the simulations are more rigid, right? Like it's what you expected to happen with those objects and their materials. And I think it was when it's built, there were more exciting parts that you kind of put in your reenactment. And you talked about inclusivity, having a digital part as well. And I think after the COVID, we all struggled kind of transferring our physical installations to digital. And I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so kind of what the web app for Noodle Soup is really funny. So like we were like, it's for the people who are there, so they know what to do with the noodles. There's like a link to the Instagram hashtags, and you can see it under construction. Nobody used it. Like we're like, oh, everybody's gonna use it. We're like announcing there's flyers, but then nobody ever like used it. And I find that to be hilarious. Like we spent so much time working on this thing and nobody ever used it. So for those, like we were really like, oh, we want to like encourage people to use the noodles, but everybody then started like, it's by touch, right? Like, you can pull something, it becomes a little bit more physical when it comes to that. So it's funny because like the web page actually failed. Like nobody ever used it. When it comes to like the simulations and reenactments, like these that we try to do in this physical world during COVID, it's tough because I think it's because we're mostly just online. Like we teach online, we're in our office a lot. Like I don't really go outside anymore. So like, how can we make happy things? It's really a thing for us. Like we're proponents that architecture should be compassionate, it should be ethical, it should be delightful and colorful. So we're trying to just be kind of like be like a bright spot in a sad moment.
Mhm.
Yeah. We don't take ourselves too seriously.
Yeah, and I think we like to like our speculative work is basically a kind of form of play,
Yeah.
right? We play with new technologies and we play with you know, new gadgets that we find, and we really try to push their limits in a sense, and just like try to get as much knowledge about how all of this stuff is affecting the way that we think, right? So you know, like most architects, I think we're sort of generalists. You know, we know a little bit of code, we know like a little bit about like material, these kind of material, experimental materials that we're dealing with, and we're just trying to like find exciting things, exciting moments out of the everyday and really exaggerate those. We've also, I think we're really, really good at making very cheap things. Like it's like dumb as that might seem. Like we're very good at making cheap objects. Like Noodle Soup, we came in under budget. For the sideshow, I think we did that whole thing for like under $500. You know, I think our paper space also was like very, very small, and again, we try to find free things. We try to find cheap materials. That, you know, we use a lot of duct tape and Mylar and etc.
Yeah, because before us, almost every single winner before us, was able to double the budget because they were a 10-year track. They had university funding. We were lecturers at Ohio State, so we couldn't get any funding because we just were not at that level. Like we weren't professors, so we're like, we have to keep to 15,000. Like we cannot put all of this in a credit card.
Yeah, and so, and even in our teaching, we use the same kind of strategies, right? Yeah. We sort of look at accessible materials. Yeah. You know, we don't think that studio should break the bank at all.
No. Yeah, especially because, you know, we don't know what socioeconomic our students are coming from. Like I personally like worked 4 jobs to apply to grad school. So we have to be really cognizant that, you know, some of our students just can't afford like the nice plexi that we ask. So we also try to be compassionate in studios and like, not everybody can afford it. It's great if you can, but if you can, we can disadvantage you already.
So we have another question in the chat. You mentioned that you are interested in filmmaking. I couldn't help but think about the film Rear Window when you showed the elevator project. The voyeuristic quality stands out. Is this something that you thought about conceptually?
We thought about it, the views of it were really important. I liked the fact that you connected to Rear Window. I don't think we exactly connected it to Rear Window. I think like I have like one IMDb page because I was like an art director for my friend's thesis in undergrad. So all my friends are in film, and like I think we've always been kind of interested in film. So like we're interested in view, so how we view it and how that affects your perception of the project.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to pull up a video. So our project 4x4 house is kind of an ongoing experiment, right? So we're starting to rethink like, you know, how this can be arranged, maybe even like how it can be almost realized. I don't know, who knows? But really, what we've recently done is we made a simulation of the 4x4 house in operation. Right, so we've actually built a video game simulation that was exhibited in Chicago at the Night Gallery, run by Future Fern, and it's a simulation that played basically like I think they had it on like almost all night, and it runs in real time, and so the modules move up and down, and sometimes what's really interesting about that simulation is that they misalign and sometimes they align. So sometimes you do get like a shot, like an enfilade shot straight through the house. Sometimes you do get more voyeuristic perspectives, and those become kind of interesting. But essentially, yes, like views were super, super interesting. But it's also like a project about alignment, right? You know, about misalignment and alignment, right? Sometimes we think of switches in architecture, like a door is either like fully open or fully closed, or you're on one floor and then you're in another floor. But like, what happens in between floors? Like, what happens if your elevator is like stuck in between? I think, and when that happens in a sitcom or something like that, it's really exciting for us, right? Because you have like things kind of start to, I don't know, the unexpected actually becomes a little bit more interesting.
It was also kind of funny to think about as like a familial negotiation. So like negotiating with your parents to move a module so you could have more privacy, or like a guest getting stuck in the bathroom because like the modules move and they're like, wait, I'm up here. So these kind of like sitcom elevator funny events, like it's in Friends, it's in almost every sitcom that we've seen. There's always an elevator stuck. Or in heist movies, there's always an elevator because people climb through them. And does it play?
I can play it.
Oh, that's the intro.
No, that's not.
That's
us.
the intro. That's us. I don't want to see us. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, just put this in the background.
It's called like, let me tell you about my house.
Just captivated by the animation. Okay, great. Any other folks want to ask a question either on the Zoom or on the YouTube? Feel free to chime in.
I have one last question. You were talking about these architectural scenes and reenacting them, and it was interesting to see that you actually visualize a making of a product. I'm a product designer, by the way, so I work in a different scale, and you explain it in a way that when architectural model happens, it's so big that you well, human is removed while showing the prototypes or while the making things. And actually with product design, we see more and more people involvement, especially if it's the experimental process. And the way I'm familiar with the technique that you're talking about, and it's very involved process. And I've seen friends doing videos about it. And I find it very interesting that you created those reenactments, and it creates a story and narrative around it. And it's a way that projects and making moment live afterwards. And it's quite an interesting way. But I'm wondering, I'm sure you recorded it to be able to, so there's different layers to reach that reenactment image, right? Because, or is it imaginary? Like you imagined those two people and you knew the process because you'd done it and then just got a frame?
Half and half, probably. So half of them are like when we're showing like the Xerox with the beanbags, that's a recreation specific image, but some of them are more things that we saw. So like the Noodle Soup reenactments, those were half what we saw, half what we think people were doing. Like people bringing a bicycle to the site seems plausible.
Yeah. And for the plastic fabrication project, that was basically piecing together the
what we did.
iPhone pictures that we took of the process, and then we just recreated them. There's also a kind of agenda about format, let's say, to kind of cleanly set up the story like you're suggesting. I think that's obviously part of it, right? Because we don't. Sometimes I think it's nice to reveal a kind of bad photograph of the process that you have, but I think it's really interesting to look at it a little bit more closely. It also helps you slow down, right? I think making these images, it takes so long, and it's such a tedious process that it does help us think a little bit more because it's so slow. So in a way, it's also just a kind of personal way of working.
I feel like it helps us relearn the project. Like it really does bring closure.
It's also mostly very hard to document while you're making the product or project, right? It's like
Yeah.
the last thing designers mostly think about, unless you have a specific person's job is to document things.
Mhm.
So it's mostly people have very bad pictures out of making processes. So it's interesting to see those reenactments. Thank you. Thank you. It was great presentation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just doing one quick check. Okay, so yeah, I think that's all of our questions also from the YouTube. Galo and Stephanie, thank you so much. This was super enjoyable. It was really fun to learn more about your work. And yeah, we're really grateful for you bringing this kind of energy to our lecture series. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
See ya.
Bye.
Thank you.